A very warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Nozipho, Mbanjwa. For the first time, Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, played host to the 24th edition of Africa's World Economic Forum under the theme Forging Inclusive Growth, Creating Jobs. Tonight on the show, we delve into some of the important issues that emerged from this meeting of the minds. Well, joining me in studio to share their impressions and opinions about the World Economic Forum on Africa is Martyn, the CEO of Frontier Advisory, Anthony Thunstrom, COO of KPMG Africa, and joining us from our Cape Town studios, we're joined by Jayendra, Naidoo, Executive Chairman at J&J Group. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Lovely to have you as always. Anthony, let's start off with you. What is the value of WEF Africa and how does this differ from WEF Davos?
Zippo, I think there are probably two sides to WEF and then maybe something even more subtle behind that. The first side, I think, is if you take a look at the government involvement. I think 15 various foreign governments represented in Abuja, and I think we saw some really significant investments and commitments being actually committed to in Abuja, something like $60 billion plus, I think hugely significant. At the same time, behind the scenes, there's a lot of private sector networking, deal making taking place. And then thirdly, I think there's just something about national pride. One of the things that really struck me is we had a lot of Nigerian volunteers literally whisking us through Lagos Airport and through Abuja Airport, which otherwise can be quite time consuming. Many of our party actually tried to tip some of these people to thank them, and the response we got every single time was, no, this is important for Nigeria. We want you as visitors to really see the best of Nigeria. You could sense the pride in Nigeria, and I think very similar to what happened in South Africa around the World Cup.
Martyn, other than these symbolic points that Anthony has spoken about, what did WEF Africa 2014 actually achieve? Well,
it's the first World Economic Forum Africa meeting ever to take place in West Africa. And of course, these days, Nigeria being the size that it is, it was almost expected that it would be held in Nigeria despite the challenges and the security issues which you well know we are facing leading up to it. I think the forum, building on what Anthony said, there's obviously commercial outcomes, some apparent, some some less apparent perhaps. The knowledge one obtains from the phenomenal conversations that take place at the forum, and ultimately the forum has an unprecedented convening power to bring people from business, from government, from academia, from civil society together in one place and trying to thrash out the problems. In this case, you mentioned Davos earlier. Davos is perhaps double in size and adopts global issues. This is more specifically African. I think it was too Nigerian perhaps. So we didn't talk about sort of smaller countries in the region. It was very Nigeria focused. I think the opportunity could have been more of a West Africa story than purely Nigeria story. But nevertheless, the forum went off relatively well considering the security situation and the concern many of us had beforehand.
Jay, let's come to you in Cape Town and let's just have a quick look at the agenda that was set for this particular meeting of the minds. Forging inclusive growth, creating jobs. From your experience of the meeting, did you get a sense walking away that that was what dominated the conversation and that's what was achieved at that particular meeting?
I think, as Martyn was saying, forum is really a gathering place for people to come and talk and to engage and to network and get to understand the agenda that underlines the statements that companies and governments make in public and what really are the personalities and the issues and the nuances behind. And so there's a large number of engagements which I think allows you to understand much better the behavior of all of these key actors. The theme is a perennial theme, inclusive job growth and jobs creation. And I don't think you'd expect a conference to solve this for any country, let alone Africa as a whole. But it was a very useful point of engagement. And of course, on the back of all of this, people are looking and understanding how to work together, how to participate in this opportunity that this particular government is looking at, or that particular government, how to invest. So I think it was quite useful. It's about the fourth time that it's been held out of South Africa, these Africa World Economic Forum events. There was one a long time ago in Namibia, and then it had its time in South Africa, and now every second year it's somewhere else. It was in Ethiopia, it was in Tanzania, and now in Nigeria. And it's actually a very good way to open up these countries to other African participants, especially for South Africa, especially for myself. It was my first trip to Nigeria, and they made a good impression. It's a tough country, but things happen there and things can be done there. So I think it was very useful.
Anthony, just to, before you add to that, I mean, we can't overlook the fact that there was a lot of the Boko Haram stories sort of making coverage around the same time, and I think Martyn alluded to this as well. To what extent did that maybe overshadow or maybe even undermine the meeting?
Yeah, to be honest, Nozipho, I think it's obviously a big story. It's something that's being taken very seriously globally. Quite frankly, I don't think it had a negative impact at all in terms of what actually happened. Almost in a surprising way. If anything, I think it focused people's attention on the business they were there for. There was huge security everywhere. Frankly, once you got into the secure WEF zone, it wasn't easy to come and go. You weren't going to wander off and not make the most of the event. Personally, I think it really didn't have a negative impact at all.
From a regional perspective, do you think that questions around the security of the region and a refocus on terrorism in Africa in particular were addressed in the appropriate manner on those platforms, Martyn? Well,
I think more, of course, security was a discussion point, but perhaps even more could have been placed and more emphasis placed on it. For me, if you're looking at the whole sort of Sahara region, central, moving into West Africa, the future of never mind the short-term Africa Rising narrative, but the future success of African states in that region is predicated on basic security, and the state itself often is very dysfunctional, including arguably the federal government of Nigeria, to provide the most basic of security for its citizens, and that can apply to many other countries in the region. Predominantly most of them are francophone African countries. So I think it's as we're looking at sort of West Africa, an extremely populated region of the continent, I think security, we tend to be superficial, maybe even arguably commercially superficial at times. We talk about the demographic story, the consumer story, and I think the security story underpins all of this. Without an internal secure situation, surely an economy cannot sustainably thrive long term.
Jay, just to quickly look at perhaps the people who did not make the forum, and in particular our own President Jacob Zuma, understanding that we ourselves were having our 5th democratic election. Did this stand out? And in particular, let's also talk about brand South Africa not being there. Did this convey any message about South Africa's support for WEF Africa when it is outside of South Africa?
Well, I think it's quite understandable that President wasn't in Nigeria on South Africa's election day, and that most people who were actually voting, I think for many of the South African delegates, myself included, we had to take advantage of the special vote procedure to register for that and go and vote on the Monday. So we were having a little bit of fun with each other, just checking the left thumb for the little bit of ink and see who actually did that and who didn't. And it was good to see that both South Africans who were there had actually voted already. There was a number of people, not only from South Africa, from Europe and other places, who, because of the security situation and the increasing threats, the US on the Monday also issued some advisory about risk in Lagos. So for many companies, that level of risk was too much. So there was a large and noticeable absenteeism, which I think is unfortunate, but at the same time understandable. It was very secure convention, a large security presence. So I think for the delegates who were there, once you arrived, you didn't feel any sense of threat. But just to pick up on what's been said in Joburg, social conflict is a key factor in all countries now, increasingly. And I think the positive about Africa, which is kind of strange to take the positive out of this tragic Boko Haram action, but the positive is that relative to 20 years ago, 1994, where there was genocide in Rwanda, there were wars in over 20 countries in Africa, the areas of conflict now are much less. Kenya has had terrorism, Nigeria is having terrorism, There's a conflict in South Sudan. But relatively speaking, Africa as a whole has got governments that are well established. And it'll be interesting to see how they deal with the Boko Haram situation. But now there's a multi-country mission underway to go and find those girls and rescue them and deal with the situation. So I think overall, security situation is something to watch, but it is manageable. Depending on what kind of business activities you're involved in.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have talked to some extent now about how this meeting enables the coming together of government and business onto the same page. And I want to bring it back to that conversation and understanding that this is, to a large extent, supposed to be an effective talk shop, but one will always look for some sort of progress that is tangible. Was there anything that came out of this meeting where we saw government and business coming together, whether it be with a commercial or developmental agenda or a combination of the two, that we can pinpoint, Anthony, and say this is what one of the outcomes of WEF Africa 2014?
Yeah, Nozipho, I think I've already mentioned, for me, one of the big commitments was the Chinese commitment to Nigeria specifically, but I think it goes beyond Nigeria. It's a bigger African play. I think that's hugely significant. China's been here for a long time, but it's not that often that they make big in advance public commitments. For me, back on the private sector side, one of the things that I really saw happening there, and it happened in at least 2 meetings where I was present, was you had private sector companies that had been operating in Africa for a long time and who had frankly been very successful. They'd earned good profits, good returns, sitting at the same table with some very large multinational organizations who'd maybe put a toe into Africa, but who still had some doubts. Just watching people compare notes and people listening to those who'd already been successful and who'd already done it, you could see the difference in attitude by the end of those discussions. And I would put very good money on the fact that we are going to see some significant multinational additional investment that probably wasn't on the cards post WEF Abuja.
A tangible outcome for you, Martyn?
2 things. Firstly, I'm Nigeria specific, and secondly, continental wide. I'm Nigeria specific. The business community attending the forum committed $10 million US dollars for this Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and rightfully so. The Nigerian government committed that as well, matched that. Of course, it's not a finance issue; it's a commitment, and it's more of a military strategic issue, perhaps. And to mention the Chinese, the Chinese have used the World Economic Forum clearly here to reaffirm their commitment to Africa. A lot of the commitments, stated financial commitments, were sort of rehashed from previous years, but there were some new things as well, especially on the sort of cross-border rail projects, aerospace hubs, and the like, which is very interesting indeed. I was chairing a session with the CEO of Equity Bank, the CEO of EcoBank West Africa, and the CEO of DHL Africa, on the African consumer. And it always surprises me that, you have such a security concern situation, political frustrations perhaps in many instances, but business confidence is so high.
Yeah.
It's quite incredible. So in a country that is complex and confusing and often difficult to operate as Nigeria, business confidence remains exceedingly high, and the numbers attending the forum certainly attest to that. Now, for me, that was once again reaffirming the commitment of these multinationals to the African consumer story.
You're still watching Invest Africa. Do remember that we value your suggestions and your feedback. So please send us an email. That's investafrica@abn360.com, or interact with us on Twitter. The show's hashtag is #InvestAfrica. The handle is @CNBC Africa, or you can follow me at Nozipho Mbanjwa. Still with me, my guests, Martyn Davies, CEO of Frontier Advisory, Anthony Thunstrom, COO of KPMG Africa, and Jayendra Naidoo, Executive Chairman at J&J Group, joining us from our Cape Town studios. Jay, let me come to you in Cape Town first. Just before the break in Johannesburg, we're just touching on the Chinese aspect of the Africa Rising story. Let's go back to that, and in particular, the talk of a slowdown in the Chinese economy and the fact that the numbers seem to speak to this. To what extent was this one a key concern in the discussions that were had at the meeting?
Well, China is actually paradoxically a growing investor in Africa. I don't think it was a big focus point. There's been years when the US economy has been down, the European economy has been down, But in Africa's economies are driven primarily by being a generator of resources. The oil and gas play is big in Africa. The natural resources play is big. And Africa has so many undeveloped resource opportunities that despite the cyclical downturn in the global economy, one of the South African bankers made a very good point that the availability of the undeveloped resources in Africa will continue to be the basis for a positive investment story in Africa for the time to come. So, the Indians have become the biggest trading partner of Nigeria just this past 12 months. So China, India, the US, the Germans, and hopefully the South Africans, because South Africa is becoming much more present.
Yeah.
Africa has got some big investment flows coming in.
Martyn, seeing you nodding to that as Jay was speaking.
I think there's two things on the China-Africa story. Firstly, and as Jayendra rightly alluded, strong commodity prices, China-driven commodity supercycle has underpinned African growth in recent years. As China slows, what impact will this have? And it's already having an impact in certain commodities, copper particularly, and that'll affect countries like Zambia, DRC amongst others. So is it speed or size? Is the trade flows, the China slowdown may have a knock-on effect negatively on sub-Saharan African growth. However, on the trade side of things, trade continues to boom. Current projections, and Premier Li Keqiang in his speech at the forum, along with Goodluck Jonathan, stated that by 2020, which is 6 years away, trade will double from existing $200-odd billion to $400 billion, despite the Chinese economic slowdown. So clearly, that's a staggering figure.
And then let's bring the Chinese conversation to, and in particular, I want to find out whether, this talk of political conditionalities that seem to be associated with China's investment in the continent was something that received any attention at all.
I think probably maybe two things to pick up on, Nozipho. I think firstly, just to close the conversation on the impact of the China slowdown, I think if we were having this conversation 5 or 10 years ago, I think it would have been a more significant concern. I think what we have to recognize is that commodities really are not the only thing driving Africa's growth at the moment. Again, depending on which economic data you look at and the time periods and the countries concerned, probably in the region of 55 to 60% of the current growth in Africa is non-commodities linked. So that's consumer demand, consumer spending, services, etc. And then just the element of infrastructure build. That in itself is typically not linked on a short cycle term to commodity prices. It's a much longer term cycle. Around the conditionality of some of the China investments, I think certainly the sense that I got is that there's been an improvement around that. I think the concerns were greater in the past. Certainly the messaging that is coming out of China is that they've also learned some lessons from some of their previous forays into Africa, and that is no longer acceptable to many African governments across the continent. And as democracy tends to still be sweeping across many countries in Africa, frankly, populaces in Africa aren't prepared to put up with that.
Jay, Anthony has raised a very important point, and this is around the infrastructure build. And oftentimes when we're looking at the continent, we also have to take into consideration the funding deficit. Now, in addition to partners like China, there's also been efforts such as the Africa 50 Fund from the African Development Bank. But just a takeaway from you on the infrastructure front, did you get a sense that infrastructure had become top of mind for African governments, and that the funds necessary to bring that infrastructure required for development were going to be flowing from the private sector as hoped?
There's a massive infrastructure deficit, and in fact, if you take Nigeria as an example, it's nearly half oil and gas, and the other half from infrastructure to retail. It's goods and services that people consume, which they're paying much more for, a lower standard, lower quality of goods than, say, South African consumers are used to in all those categories. So there's a massive opportunity to provide more industrial and infrastructural and service capacity. And but the infrastructure, generally that tends to require large state-owned enterprises or public sector entities or the national government or the provincial governments there to be counterparties to enable the flow of private sector funds or funds from other governments into these things, and that's where the credit standing of most of African countries are lagging behind. So interventions like this Africa 50 and the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the IDC getting more appetite for investing in countries north of the SADC region. All of those things is actually creating a bigger capital base. There's a lot of learning taking place, but I think there's more money becoming available, and you've got to align both money as well as the technical know-how, so you're designing projects and eliminating the issues that are blockages, carefully. So speaking from my point of view as a young South African company's young. I'm a little bit older, of course.
You should have seen all the looks in Johannesburg. We all looked up in surprise.
Yeah, so from the point of view of a young company that's been South Africa focused up to now, we're starting to find our way into infrastructure opportunities in other African countries and West Africa in particular. And there's some very interesting opportunities that we think are doable.
Well, underpinning infrastructure, Martyn, is of course regional integration, not a new idea. I'm quite certain at this platform as well, it's not about whether regional integration is good or not, it's about addressing the blockages and accelerating the pace. Did you walk away with the sense that there was renewed optimism and renewed commitment to integrating the continent?
Criticism, perhaps. At every World Economic Forum, without fail, every Africa Summit, we always talk about education, the imperative education, infrastructure, regional integration, inter-regional trade, and often governments pay lip service to this. There's not insufficient follow-through. What often is not what's spoken about is the need for enhanced government efficiency and government functionality. That is often the obstacle, the handbrake to more rapid development in the continent. Now, in Nigeria's case, as mentioned earlier, the region integration, Nigeria is a standalone country of 170 million people. You don't go to Nigeria with a view to going somewhere else in a region. So the following words were not mentioned in 3 days of World Economic Forum. Senegal, Gambia, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc. So it was very much of a Nigeria type story. We talk about region integration, but I'm not seeing enough of it beyond the East Africa region, which is quite progressive. Other regions, particularly West Africa, is very guilty of it. Southern Africa, Central, we're somewhat laggards in terms of freeing markets and allowing goods, capital, talent to flow across borders. And without this progress of region integration, which I'm afraid is far, far too slow compared to the Europeans, North Americans, even the Asians, I'm deeply concerned about the future of small economies in Africa. If we also focus on the big demographic type countries like the Nigerias, like the Congos, like the Kenyas and South Africas, etc., Ethiopias perhaps, what about the Malawis, the Gambias, the Sierra Leones, the Gabons, the Namibias? What's the future of these countries commercially and developmentally in Africa?
On the basis of those questions, I'm coming to you, Anthony, because we've got less than a minute, so I'm giving you 20 seconds for a quick rebuttal and your biggest takeaway from the meeting.
No rebuttal, I agree entirely with Martyn. Just to point out one practical thing that I heard suggested on more than one occasion. It sounds very simple, but I think it would actually be a step in the right direction. There were a lot of calls to either do away with inter-Africa visas for people, business people, to be able to travel a lot more simply. If that happened, I think you'd actually see people traveling being exposed to investment opportunities. Just my closing comment, really happy that so many people did attend Abuja. For me, it's probably the single most important WEF event that I've seen.
The single most important WEF Africa event that he's seen, that's Anthony Thunstrom. We have unfortunately come to the end of this week's episode of Invest Africa. Thank you again to all my guests. Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.